Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking another look at redistricting around the country ahead of the 2022 midterm elections. We're going to be talking about Maryland and the recent court decision there that struck down the proposed maps in the state and how that decision may impact other redistricting lawsuits around the country. Now, as of today, March 26th, we only have 5 states outstanding in their map submissions ahead of the midterm elections. So only 5 states haven't proposed maps yet. There's a couple of states we're going to talk about that are currently under litigation. Their maps may change. And of course, with the Maryland decision, I think there's certainly a case to be made that you could possibly see the Democratic gerrymander in New York also struck down, and maybe either Texas or Georgia as well, although I'm not too confident about those. So we'll talk about those later on in this video, but first I want to take a look at the state of Maryland. This is the map that was struck down by a federal judge, I believe, yesterday, and it was struck down on the basis that the map was egregiously partisan gerrymandered. The districts weren't compact, and they weren't keeping communities alike together. So, those are oftentimes common criteria for redistricting in many states around the country. And I was surprised that this Maryland map got struck down, quite frankly, because the state of Maryland hasn't struck down a map in decades. There's always been lawsuits on the congressional maps every decade, and none of those lawsuits really went anywhere in the state of Maryland. So the fact that this map got struck down is pretty surprising. Also, given the fact that Democrats have a supermajority in the state of Maryland, and Maryland Democrats were very militant about getting this map passed. So this is certainly a blow to Democrats that this map had failed. Now, it doesn't mean that the Republicans are going to get their 6-2 proposal, which would give the Republicans 2 districts instead of 1. And keep in mind that Maryland is a state that routinely votes about 33% Republican in national elections now. So with the 1 district, Republicans only get about 12.5% of the representation, whereas with 2, you get a much more balanced, you get about 25%, which is a much more balanced situation in the state. So, this map being struck down is a pretty big deal because there are a number of other gerrymandered maps that could potentially be in jeopardy because of this decision. Now, this is the first Democrat-approved map to actually be struck down in the country. We've seen a number of Republican proposals be struck down, such as Ohio and in North Carolina. So this is the first time we're seeing it be applied to Democrats as well. Now, this redistricting cycle saw a much more aggressive approach by Democrats to gerrymander their states as a way to sort of counter Republican gerrymandering in states like Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia in the past. So Democrats have been very militant in this approach, redistricting states like Illinois pretty egregiously to the point where Democrats, are basically getting all but 3 seats in a state that Donald Trump got about 40% of the vote in. So, that's not really a very even spread, to say the least. But you also have maps in the state of New York as well, which bring Republican representation down significantly. It cuts it in half. As well as the state of New Mexico, which is a state that typically votes around 43% Republican, with all 3 of the districts going toward the Democrats. Now, this might actually backfire on Democrats if this map does end up being the map, because you could see potentially Republicans taking 2 of the state's congressional districts instead of the 1 that they were almost guaranteed under the old map. So this could actually backfire on the Democrats, but as of right now, it still is a pretty unfair map given that Democrats have the advantage in every single district, despite, again, New Mexico voting about 43% or so in national elections for the Republican Party. So, these gerrymanders are pretty egregious. Republicans have had their fair share of egregious maps. Some people would argue that the Ohio map is still pretty slanted in favor of the Republicans because they have the advantage in all but 3 districts in a state that only voted 53% Republican in the last election. Now, obviously, Republicans do have an advantage when it comes to redistricting because Republicans are much more spread out as an electorate. Democrats are hyper-concentrated in very small geographic cities, whereas Republicans are spread out across, the rest of the state. Most of the rural areas of any given state. So it gives Republicans an inherent advantage in any state, really, when it comes to redistricting. So it is a challenge for Democrats to actually get a more balanced map in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania. Although Pennsylvania is a bit more even than the state of Ohio, but it is hard to get even maps without, really Democratic gerrymandering in some of these states, just because, you have these small compact areas that have the same population as the other districts, but vote about 80 to 90% Democrat. And statewide, that makes the margins relatively close, but when you actually break it down into congressional districts, it only gives the Democrats 2 or maybe 3 districts in a state that they get around 45% of the vote in totally. But, this Maryland decision could impact, again, other states around the country. Now, there's still litigation going on in Texas, although I don't really think that this is really going to be overturned. Similarly, with Georgia, we've seen litigation going on with the congressional map. Currently, the Democrats only have 5 districts. Again, this is a state that Democrats actually won in the last election by a super narrow margin. But it is roughly a 50-50 state now, and I would even argue that Georgia somewhat leans to the left now based on the 2018 and 2021 election results we've seen. So there was a decision that could have overturned the Alabama map, which, again, only has 1 Democratic district. That was actually stopped. Alabama was allowed to keep its, Republican gerrymander, and as a result, a lot of other states that could have been impacted, again, this had to do with black representation, other states that could have been impacted, such as South Carolina and Georgia, now Republicans don't have to abide by those guidelines, so they can draw the districts in a way that, basically gives the Democrats only, 1 district in a state like South Carolina. A state like Mississippi, 1, although I'd argue in Mississippi this is probably a pretty fair map, given that the Democratic vote is basically concentrated in the western portion of the state, so it is a pretty fair map based on that. But all in all, we've seen a pretty ugly battle across the country in regards to gerrymandering, and, this time the Democrats actually fought back in a pretty fierce way against Republicans. In 2014, Republicans had a huge advantage due to gerrymandering. They gerrymandered states like Virginia pretty effectively. This was a state that went to Obama in 2008 and 2012, yet Republicans were winning all but 3 Democratic districts, 3 districts in the entire state. North Carolina was another state that had been super gerrymandered. Of course, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and states all across the country. And, this largely was due to circumstance, good circumstances for the Republican Party. Because in 2010, the Republicans were able to flip a ton of governorships, which as a consequence was able, again, with the power of the legislatures, were able to draw pretty advantageous maps for Republicans in some states that, Republicans really weren't winning. States, again, like Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina they were winning, but Virginia, states like that. So, the 2018 elections were a pretty big deal because a lot of Republican governors, went down or, couldn't run for re-election. People like Scott Walker and others. So that really had a huge impact on redistricting this time around. Obviously, if North Carolina had a Republican governor, the Republicans would have had a much easier time getting through a Republican-favored map. Although I'm not sure how much of a role the governor actually does play, because I think actually in North Carolina, it's one of the few states where the legislature doesn't need the approval of the governor. But there's certainly other states around the country that previously had Republican governors. For instance, Pennsylvania, you would have had a much more favorable map to Republicans, most likely with a Republican governor. Obviously, Wisconsin, this is really the fairest it's going to get either way. Just the geography of Wisconsin really has Democratic votes only concentrated in Milwaukee and Dane County. So this map wasn't really going to change much either way, but with a lot of swing states having Democratic governors now, it has, given the Democrats more of a fighting chance in the 2022 midterms to actually lessen the blow that's likely to come to them in these midterms. Because, as of right now, based on Biden's approval, based on trends, it's not looking too good for Democrats around the country, and they really need some of these key victories. And, you know, even with Republicans likely to take back the House, it's really a question of how many seats their majority is going to be by. And, you know, whether or not other maps like New Mexico and New York get struck down is really going to determine this. Because if the New York gerrymander gets struck down, for instance, that's 4 seats that were almost guaranteed to go to Democrats now, which they'd taken from the Republicans in the prior redistricting, now would go probably to Republicans. They'd lose another 4 seats. So they certainly would lose their advantage that they currently have in the redistricting process based on gerrymandering. Now, we're still waiting on Florida. Florida is a really big state to come out. This obviously is going to be a map favorable to Republicans. Florida is a Republican state, and they're likely to make the map as, again, as good for them as possible, because they're going to be combating, you know, the aggressive Democratic gerrymandering. And again, the gerrymandering goes on both sides, especially this election cycle. It's not really as one-sided as it was in 2014, where Republicans were gerrymandering most of the states, with maybe the exception of Maryland and California. But regardless, you know, the 2022 election cycle is really going to be decided by turnout. Even in a state like New York, again, where you have these aggressive gerrymanders, if Republican turnout is high enough, you could see some of the districts that are D+6, you know, D+4, D+3, all of these districts going to Republicans, but it would be a much harder battle with these unfair maps than it would be with a sort of competitive map. And again, the same goes to, you know, any of these other gerrymandered states as well. So again, we'll have to see where these redistricting lawsuits actually end up. The Maryland one was a really big one, and I do wonder if states like New Mexico and New York will also be overturned as well. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.